Welcome back, everyone, as we are finally ready to dive into this new series from Extra History. You guys have been asking for it, but I like to give the original content creator some time to let their series kind of get out there and breathe a little bit. And this one started, I think, about a month ago, and the last episode of it came out a week or two ago, so we're ready to go ahead and start looking at Napoleon in Egypt. You know I love Extra History. I've probably reacted to their channel more than any other just because I love their presentation style. I love how they tell a story. They're nice kind of bite-sized chunks of things, and they cover a wide range of topics. So you can check out some of the other Extra History stuff I've done over time. Just kind of do a search for Vlogging Through History, Extra History, or just start looking on the channel. You'll see it all there. So let's go ahead and dive into this one. It's going to be interesting reading about this because this is really before Napoleon has conquered most of Europe, right? This is kind of one of his, I wouldn't say his earliest battles because he's already kind of been rising to the top by this point, but he's still only like 30 years old at this point. He's not an emperor yet. He hasn't taken that leadership. He's actually going to do that after Egypt. So let's go ahead and dive in. The link is in the description to the original content.
First, 1798. Napoleon Bonaparte stands in front of his troops. He reveals that within hours, they will land in Egypt. Soon, he says, they will defeat the Mameluke sultans, then they will stay as an occupying force. The people amongst whom we're going to live are Muslims, he says, their first article of faith being this: there is but one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Do not contradict them. He then reminds the army that their forerunners, the Roman legions, protected all religions. He insists that Egyptian Muslims be treated with the same respect the army has shown Christians and Jews, and that their rituals, mosques, and priests are not to be interfered with. And soldiers must accommodate Muslim ways, even though their treatment of women differs from Europe. Now, the first town we shall come to was built by Alexander, he says, suggesting that they'll emulate the great conqueror's success. But, and I hate to do this at the beginning of the series, spoiler alert, they're not gonna.
No, not at all. But I will say this about Napoleon. There are plenty of criticisms to make of Napoleon, and we cannot get around the fact that his wars cost the lives of millions of people. But to compare him to other dictators like the Hitlers and Stalins of the world is a gross disservice to Napoleon. I think while his methods may not be worth praising, and while the fact that he, like I said, led to the death of so many people must be considered, he did try really hard to do right by the people that he ruled. And you can see a glimpse of that here. He's trying to be respectful of other cultures, other religions, while simultaneously going in and fighting a war of conquest against those people. But that's just kind of the dichotomy that is all people, right? There are the things to be praised about people, and there are the things to be very critical of about people. And I think in Napoleon, like most, you have both.
Thanks so much to Factor for keeping us well fed on a historically busy schedule. The French invasion of Egypt in 1798 is sometimes treated like a sideshow in the Napoleonic Wars, just one of many rungs in a ladder that helped Napoleon to power while inventing Egyptology as a byproduct. But this view is vastly underselling it as an event, especially since it centers on how it impacted Europe rather than a wider picture of how it also affected North Africa and the Middle East. This was the first time since the Crusades that European armies had invaded the region, and this time they came armed with vastly superior weapons technology and an intention to bring Enlightenment ideals in order to liberate the people there. In other words.
And that's a pretty common strategy to use for what we would call today winning the hearts and minds, right? Is that you make the argument not only to your own people and your own soldiers, but also to the people that you're conquering. Hey, we're here to help you. We're here to bring the great things about our culture and our way of life to you as well. The same thing happens in the conquest of the West with Manifest Destiny with the United States. As they spread west and they're conquering these native lands, they're trying to Americanize a lot of these indigenous peoples. They're trying to Christianize them. And I believe that a lot of those people doing those things genuinely thought they were helping those people by doing that stuff. And I think that's probably the case here too.
It's not only frequently cited as the first modern colonialist project, it will also set some patterns that will look all too familiar to the more modern Western interventions in the Middle East. During his invasion, Napoleon would try to secure his hold by removing an unpopular regime, installing allies, appealing to religious commonalities, and exploiting ethnic, religious, and political division for his own benefit.
Which never happens today, right?
Now, of course, I hear you asking, is this gonna get cringe? To which I will respond with a resounding, oh yeah. I'm talking like Napoleon wearing a turban, proclaiming himself a champion of Islam, and wanting to unite all Muslim nations under one banner level of cringe. We'll get there. But right now, it's May 7th.
Listen, I will say this, and I understand that Extra History is presenting this to a modern audience, and they're trying to keep that in mind as they present this stuff. But, it would appear cringe to many of us now, but I don't know that it was necessarily going to be seen that way at that time. I think it was the natural thing for what Napoleon was trying to accomplish.
1798, and troops are flooding into the French Mediterranean port of Toulon. There are 40,000 soldiers in the harbor, 27 fighting ships, 400 transports, and a dozen generals. Some of the most famous commanders in France are here. The swashbuckling Caribbean-raised Thomas Alexandre Dumas. The former...
So let's talk about him for a second, because
are
he's...
here. The swashbuckling...
I believe he's Caribbean. I think he's like mixed race, certainly part black, and he is the father of Alexandre Dumas, who will very famously write The Count of Monte Cristo and The Three Musketeers... The Man in the Iron Mask, I think he wrote as well. Famous actor, writer. But before that, his father is a general under Napoleon.
Caribbean-raised Thomas Alexandre Dumas, the former nobleman and revolutionary Jacques-François Menoir, who'd kept international security for France for half a decade. The hero of the revolution, Jean-Baptiste Kléber, known for stubbornly holding out against royalist forces. And none of them know where they're going. Some suppose it's an attempt to kick Admiral Nelson of Britain's Royal Navy out of the Mediterranean, though others say they'll sail through Gibraltar and commence the long-rumored invasion of England. Though neither of those ideas really make sense. This force is too small to invade Britain, and their company includes a delegation of 151 savants, mathematicians, chemists, linguists, and masters of natural science who seem to think they're about to study a mysterious new land. No matter. Wherever they go, they're gonna win.
And keep in mind, and I'm sure they're going to cover this because he mentioned Egyptology already. At this point, a lot of these things, like the Sphinx, for example, is not what it is today. It's like buried up to its neck in sand. The Valley of the Kings hasn't been excavated yet. People know about the pyramids, but for the most part, those are just old ruins that are there, and people aren't paying a lot of attention to ancient Egyptian history. But that's something in the 19th century that's going to become a huge thing. And Napoleon's quest here is going to, among other things, uncover the Rosetta Stone, which is going to be one of the keys to unlocking Egyptian history.
For Napoleon leads them. But just so we can all catch up, who exactly is this mathematician turned artillery officer? Napoleon Bonaparte had risen to prominence in France by playing a key role in the uprising of 1795, when a royalist force had tried to enter Paris during a constitutional convention and seize control of the government. Napoleon had saved the day, slaughtering the incoming royalists with cannons, while the politicians tried to figure out a government that would prove stable enough to endure, while also preserving the revolution's ideals.
So one of the great things about Napoleon's story is that he's a perfect example of someone being able to rise to the top on the basis of their merits. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't have certain advantages. He came from an aristocratic family, but not a ethnically French family. His family's ethnically Italian. They live in Corsica, which I think right around the time that Napoleon is born, Corsica becomes French. But his native language is not French, and so he's got an accent when he's sent to France to go to military school. So yeah, going to military school because his father had political connections definitely gives him a leg up. But then there are a lot of people who get a military education, but Napoleon then rises to the top on the merits of his ability.
The resulting government was a 5-member committee called the Directory, and Bonaparte was their new favorite hero. As Napoleon's star ascended, he gained wealth, married a woman with powerful political connections, and
a woman whose first husband went to the guillotine. Josephine was her name.
gained command of the war in Italy. Within months, he'd broken the years-long stagnation there, soon secured an Austrian withdrawal, made war on the Pope, and smashed the Papal States. But by 1798, he was already thinking about what to do next. And honestly, so was the Directory, who was increasingly alarmed by this 28-year-old wonder kid.
So think about for a
Right
second.
when I need
oh
it.
boy, I just
Factor
skipped
also
way
gives you-
ahead on the video, didn't I? Think about for a second what people would have said about him today. He went to war against the Pope, and now he's in Egypt embracing the Muslims. I mean, the trash that would be talked about him on the news media for that kind of stuff. They would be spinning him as a closet Muslim. They would be saying he hates Christians, all this kind of stuff, just like we do today.
But by 1798, he was already thinking about what to do next. And honestly, so was the Directory, who was increasingly alarmed by this 28-year-old wonder kid. Napoleon was ruthless, competent, and ambitious, with an inherent knack of self-aggrandizing propaganda.
That's dangerous if you're in power, right? If you're in power and you see someone on the rise who has charm, talent, influence, intelligence, has all of the things that could make a great leader, you're going to kind of have a side eye on that guy, and you're probably going to start looking for ways to keep him from rising too far.
Also further enriched himself, looting the treasures of Italy, meaning that the Caesar comparisons were getting real uncomfortable. Now, they wanted him to invade England, getting him as far from the capital as possible, but Napoleon was dubious whether that would work. Instead, he proposed to capture Egypt.
If only he had thought the same thing about invading Russia later.
See, Egypt presented an indirect path toward attacking Britain. While British ship traffic to India went around Africa, message traffic went overland across Egypt to the Red Sea. And with that route conquered, French forces could link up with France's ally the Tipu Sultan, who was at this time bedeviling the East India Company forces on the subcontinent. Napoleon also argued that sugar production in the region could take the place of France's loss of Haiti, which you can watch our series on here, and it could open new avenues of trade. Besides, they could tear down the Mameluke sultans, who had oppressed French traders living in the area, and bring the liberty of the revolution to this backwards land. But honestly, there was also a more romantic reason. Enlightenment thinkers were students of the classical world, raised on the stories of the Greeks, Romans, and pharaohs. As the most ancient of the classical empires, Egypt was considered the cradle of civilization. Yet it was also still mysterious, remaining largely unknown in Europe with an ancient language that hadn't been deciphered. I mean, what treasures might lie there? What discoveries?
So a lot of the same motivations here as the motivations for Western European nations settling and conquering the New World, right? The chance for wealth, the chance for discovery, the chance for finding gold and bringing back new things. And so a lot of the same things going to now that the West is starting to rebel, and you're like Haiti, the United States, you're going to have other countries that are going to do this in the decades that follow. Now Europe's going to increasingly turn its focus toward Africa.
Conquering it, Napoleon would be reenacting the campaigns of Alexander the Great, of Caesar, even of the great French Crusader kings of the medieval era. Look, I know how silly that all sounds, but it's important to note that
I don't think it sounds silly, though. I think that sounds completely in keeping with what most leaders throughout most of history have thought. I can be the next fill in the blank. For English kings like Henry VIII, it was how can I recreate what Henry V did at Agincourt? For the French kings, it was about going back and conquering lost territory, and forever. I mean, that's a very natural thing for a military leader to want to do.
Napoleon and his officers were dead serious about this. In fact, once they left port and he informed them of their destination, the shipboard philosophical debate group he formed to pass the time argued at length about who they resembled the most. Were they more like the Roman legions or Alexander's Macedonians? Ooh, how about Caesar or Octavian? And when they arrived, would each become a Mark Antony with a beautiful Cleopatra-like Egyptian lover? Oh boy. Now, all self-aggrandizing fanfic aside, these sessions actually did help cut the tension, because this voyage was a dangerous one. Nelson's fleet was hunting for them, and the French only slipped by through sailing at night. Their lights doused, and crew told to keep quiet. First, they made the island of Malta, gateway to Egypt, and still garrisoned by the medieval Knights of Malta. Napoleon took it with minimal resistance. Since the revolution, religious contributions to the order had dried up, and half of the knights were Frenchmen who were unwilling to fight their countrymen. The Grand Master was bought off, and Napoleon stopped long enough to recruit Arabic speakers to serve as translators and intermediaries.
I think Napoleon spent a little bit of time there in Malta and kind of made that his jumping off point for the next part of what he was going to do, which makes sense. And so far, everything's going the way it should. Doesn't end up that way, but...
Then, July 1st, they arrived off Alexandria, and Napoleon gave the address we quoted at the top of this episode, instructing his men how to behave amongst the Egyptians and reminding them that they're entering a city founded by Alexander. They attacked the walls that night, following a short negotiation. In a paltry defense, 500 Mameluke soldiers with century-old muskets tried to guard a medieval wall against 4,000 of Napoleon's modern infantry. The Mameluke fire was so ineffective that when General Kleber was shot in the forehead, the bullet failed to kill him. The Mamelukes fled, and as light dawned, the French found themselves in possession of the great city of Alexandria. Scholars and officers flooded in to see the jewel of the Ptolemies, to witness the abode of Cleopatra, full of ancient splendor, and wait, what the f*** is this? This is Alexandria? Are you sure? Where are the palaces and temples and gold and incense and crap? Okay, there's Pompey's column there. Oh, and an obelisk to Cleopatra, and wait, is that it? Hold on, are those guys using a broken obelisk as a bench? Is this hieroglyphic slab holding up a doorway? What?
Like I said, and this is true, I think, in every culture, isn't it? We don't appreciate our own stuff as much as other people coming in, right? I talk to people all the time who live in the UK, for example, who have never been to London, who have never been to places like Buckingham Palace or to the Tower. I live in Northeast Ohio. I'm like not even an hour from the NFL Hall of Fame, and I'm a huge NFL football fan. I've never been to the Hall of Fame. I've been next to it for my son's soccer games that were played there for tournaments, but never been to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. I think we take for granted the things that are in our own backyard, and these guys did that with Egyptian history.
Why is everyone in rags? What happened to this place? The French were absolutely shocked. All they could fathom was that the Egyptians had forgotten their heritage, lost their status as the heirs of the classical legacy, and didn't take care of it. A diagnosis Enlightenment thinkers also ascribed to the Greeks, by the way. But the truth was, Alexandria was just old. Lots had happened in the 2,000 years since Cleopatra and Antony, after all. The course of the Nile changed, devaluing the city as a center of trade. Monuments had suffered the ravages of time, much like Roman buildings in France and Britain. Stones got reused in construction.
And all of this is not unique to Egypt either. I mean, the Mississippi River has changed many times, which is why you see weird borders at times. Other rivers do that. The Missouri River does as well. You've seen that in places like England, for example, where people tore down the abbeys that were dissolved and left them in ruins because they reused the bricks for other things. People just, at a time in history when you were poor and you were, like many of you were subsistence farmers and you're just trying to get by, and there's free bricks there, you're going to take them. You're not concerned about the 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 year old history behind that wall that you're tearing apart. You're concerned about what you need in that moment.
The whole place had never recovered from its depopulation during the Black Death, and Egypt, semi-autonomous under the Mamelukes, was one of the poorest parts of the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon had just arrived, and already Egypt was not what he expected. But surely things would be different in Cairo. French ships began to unload the instruments of war: cannons, gunpowder, an Arabic printing press to distribute propaganda, and a mobile chemistry lab for the savants to explore and categorize this new land. Everything they would need for a successful campaign. Except for the one thing they didn't bring: canteens. Which turns out would be pretty important where they're going. I mean, it's not like they were able to order a bunch of nourishing...
All right, so We're going to wrap it up right there. Great start to this series. Really excited to learn more about this. We're going to get into the Battle of the Pyramids tomorrow. What an iconic location for a battle. It's like the kind of thing you want in a video game, right? Is with the pyramids in the background as these armies are clashing and cannons are firing. Good stuff. And I'm actually going to be recording that today. I want to get back to having videos made a day in advance so our patrons and our members will be able to see those ahead of time. So if you are a patron or a member, or you become one at any level, the part 2 of this series is now available as you're watching part 1, and we'll be doing that with each of them. Tomorrow when part 2 comes out for the public, part 3 will be made available, and so on. Thanks for watching.